Good evening, guys. Hopefully everything is going well with you guys with this weekend. Hopefully you dug out the snow well. It's supposed to be like 40 degrees or upper 30s for the rest of the week. So hopefully that means a lot of melting is taking place. So we're going to be taking a look at World War II tonight, Chapter 33, Chapter 34. Because those two chapters should have been blended together, this is going to be a 25-question test. We're going to be treating the two chapters put together as one chapter combined. So we'll be able to do the 25-question test, and then we'll be able to take some time tomorrow to talk about your writing strategies to make sure that you guys are feeling really good about that writing assignment that we've been doing. And then that'll allow us to transition into the digital day. So you'll know exactly what you should be doing with your writing, and then also you'll be able to start reading Chapter 35, which is post-World War II, 1940s, early 1950s, and we'll be taking a chapter per week up until spring break, where we should be done by with the 1960s. And you'll notice that we go very slow through the 1960s, so we take a couple decades over the better course of a month, with a lot of time spent on reviewing how we link that stuff together with old stuff. And so if you've been feeling kind of shaky about getting ready for the review process for the AP test, this is where we really try to take care of that and make sure you guys are in a good place. So feel free to upload any sort of questions that you guys have, and we'll be able to run through them before we get done tonight. There are very few questions, and so hopefully that's indicative of the idea that these two chapters have a flow to them, where for a lot of kids the video lecture seems to make a lot of sense. But if you do have any questions, we can take care of that tonight. So the first question I see going on here is saying, I'm kind of mixed up about the meeting between in Tehran and the meeting in Casablanca. So the way to think about these, there are four meetings that are key for us to remember. First one is going to be Casablanca, and so Casablanca is going to be in northern Africa, and Casablanca is going to be a meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt to discuss what is going on with the war efforts between the British and the United States now that the United States is into the war. Later on, there's going to be a meeting in Tehran, which is in Iran nowadays. And so this city is going to be a location in the Middle East where we're going to be able to get both the Americans and the British and the Russians to be able to discuss with one another the ideas of what should be happening with the war effort. And so America and Russia are going to be in negotiations about the idea of a second front of the war opening up. And the Russians are going to be very disappointed because of the fact that America is going to focus first on North Africa, then on Italy, and then moving into D-Day in 1944. And so for the Russians, they were hoping that would be a meeting that would lead to a sped-up D-Day style invasion so that not all of the attacks are being thrown at Russia. Key turning point of the war is for the actual war itself, Stalingrad. And so for a lot of kids, it's kind of confusing because when we think about the American turning points, I laid out for you the Atlantic Ocean with U-boats, then North Africa, then Italy, then D-Day. But by the time of D-Day, the German advance into Russia has been stalled, and after our attacks in North Africa and the the German attempts to move through Russia, both of those efforts really stopped the German ability to take over large oil fields that they would find in either Russia or in the Middle East. And so that's going to be the path downwards from that point forward. The last two meetings that you'll want to be able to discuss are Yalta. And Yalta is going to be the last meeting between the United States, Russia, and England with what's known as the Big Three: Churchill, Stalin, and Franklin Roosevelt. And this is going to be early 1945. And it's apparent that at this point the Germans are floundering, and they start discussing what are they going to do with Europe once World War II is over. But after this point, Yalta is going to be the last meeting of those Big Three because of the fact that Churchill is going to lose an upcoming election to a guy named Clement Attlee, who is going to replace him as the leader of England. And FDR is going to have a massive brain aneurysm, and that's going to obviously then lead to Harry Truman taking over. And the final meeting they're going to hold is at Potsdam. And at the Potsdam conference, it's going to be determined that there's going to be different groups holding on to the chunks of German occupied territory after the war is done until they can start governing themselves. And it's at that meeting that Truman really miscalculates what Stalin is up to, and says we can trust Stalin, but that's going to lead to what's known as the Iron Curtain, the Cold War, and a battle between the United States and Russia from that point forward. At Potsdam also, Truman is going to announce to Japan that we've got something that can be used to attack them. We don't really tell them what the weapon is. With the atomic bomb, But we alert them that we've got something that can bring a huge amount of destruction if they don't surrender. And when they don't, they're going to have 2 atomic bombs dropped on top of them. What is going to be problematic, though, is that the Russians are not surprised by the announcement that we have atomic bombs, because they've had spies inside of our Manhattan Project, and they've been reporting back, and they've been stealing information that is going to help them to be able to develop their own atomic bomb by 1949, and that's where we're going to have an arms race that takes us into the modern era after this chapter is finished up. Another question asked about the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter is really simple. It's just a meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt in the Atlantic Ocean on a set of boats that they've set up to discuss what the alliance between America and England should look like during World War II. And they come to the agreement that they need to be allies to try to stop the advance of totalitarian dictatorships. And that's going to eventually become the foundation for the brand new United Nations that'll be created after World War II to replace the League of Nations, to hopefully have a peacekeeping organization to prevent future wars from happening. Unlike the League of Nations, where America didn't join, there's a feeling among a lot of Americans that we can't really be isolationist after World War II. And so there's a lot of Americans who understand FDR's push with the Atlantic Charter to have us be a much more involved player after World War II is done, to prevent the rise of dictatorships like we saw between World War I and World War II. What is unconditional surrender? It's simple. You learned about during the Civil War, unconditional surrender grant, or U.S. grant, and he was given that nickname because in warfare, you will sometimes have people offer to surrender on condition of them being able to keep, like in the case of Japan, they wanted to keep their emperor, they wanted to be able to keep their honor, they wanted to be able to protect certain elements of their situation, their government. And Grant was same as for announcing during his battles that he would have unconditional surrender, which means you surrender and then you are our victim and we can do whatever we want to you. And you have to trust that we're going to treat you like enemy combatants and put you in as prisoners of war, but otherwise you get no special considerations. And that's the announcement that's made for Japan at the end of World War II, is that we don't want to allow them to keep their emperor. The Americans don't want to allow concessions. There's a lot of hatred going on after Pearl Harbor and after the bloody war that they've had. And that's largely what leads to then the dropping of 2 atomic bombs, is the Japanese, many of whom don't want to surrender, and then some do, but with some special considerations. But then after the second atomic bombing, that's when they are going to surrender, and the war will be over. Let me see here. Next question is about the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act. This is the way that Roosevelt's going to be adjusting those tariffs that we saw with, like, the Smoot-Hawley tariff from the Hoover time period. And what reciprocal trade agreements mean is that if another country promises to treat us as a friendly nation, we will lower our tariffs, they will lower their tariffs until they match, and then we'll be able to trade with one another. And so however low they're willing to drop their tariffs, we'll do the same. And it's part of his good neighbor policy, where he's trying to figure out ways to patch up relationships with people in Central America, South America, the Caribbean, and other places, to try to repair the damage that was created with, like, the Roosevelt Corollary and our gunboat diplomacy that we saw going on previously. The next question is asking about the quarantine speech, and the quarantine speech was in 1937, where Franklin Roosevelt realized in 37 that he had countries getting aggressive with, like, Italy invading Ethiopia, and Germany getting aggressive, and Japan getting aggressive. So he issued his quarantine speech in 1937, saying that it was the duty of good countries to try to step in and try to slow down the aggressive behavior by quarantining the countries that are being aggressive. Now, the term quarantine is what you do with somebody who is contagiously ill, is you put them in an isolated place where they can't touch anybody else for a period of time until they're not contagious anymore. And so that's what's going on with the quarantine speech, is Roosevelt's trying to get other countries to try to cut off the expansionism of these aggressive countries. But then Roosevelt gets swatted down by a lot of isolationists inside of the United States, who are arguing that just making that announcement is making it more and more dangerous, that America is going to end up in a war. And so we back off. The League of Nations has very little power, and eventually that leads to appeasement, where a lot of European countries are going to try to give dictators like Hitler what they want in the hopes that then they'll stop being aggressive with their neighbors. And instead that sends a message, especially after the Munich Accords, where after Munich, Neville Chamberlain, the leader of England, is going to give Adolf Hitler what he wants in Czechoslovakia, and that's going to eventually then cause the collapse of Eastern Europe as Germany gets more and more aggressive. Next question is about the Office of Price Administration. Notice that it's got a New Deal style alphabet soup style logo, and the Office of Price Administration is very simple. They realize that we've got rationing taking place where there's scarcity going on. All of our factories are now producing tanks and planes and bombs and guns, and all of our farmers need to be producing food, not just for Americans, but also for the British and the French and Canadians and other sorts of people who are fighting in World War II. And so with that scarcity, there are some businesses that could start gouging people by charging them outlandish prices for their products. And so what's going to happen with the Office of Price Administration is they're going to set maximum prices for how much any products can cost. They're going to set maximum wages for how much people can get paid, and then they're going to give out rationing booklets as well. So if you want to buy stuff in a given week, like gasoline, you have a certain number of vouchers that you can use for gasoline, and once you use up those vouchers, you're not allowed to buy more. And Americans accept that as a reasonable sort of sacrifice to make, where if they're not going to go over and get shot at, the least they can do is eat less food, use less gasoline and whatever, in the hopes that they can help out the men and women who are trying to help us win the war effort. Let me see here. What is the ABC-1 agreement? ABC-1 agreement is just between America and Britain, and it's the idea that they are going to be working with one another to win against Germany first. So even though Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese, the agreement is that America must step in and help out in Europe, because if England and Russia are allowed to fall, then they've got no allies to help them out against the Japanese after the war is done. And so the hope is that America can help the British, then possibly liberate the French. They have colonial possessions in the Pacific. And then after they're done defeating the Germans, they can throw all of their force against Japan and team up all together against them. Let me see here. Next question. I know that Germany attacked Poland to start the war, but did anything happen before the war that made people want to start a war? Really good question. So remember what we talked about with the period of appeasement, as we saw in the 1920s, a Washington Naval Conference where we voluntarily limited the size of our navies. And we also promised the Japanese that America wouldn't fortify their bases in the Pacific, but Japan didn't have to. So we're setting up this idea in other countries' minds that they can become imperialistic and America won't step in and stop them. And so the earliest examples of that is going to be in 1931 when Japan invades Manchuria, and that's going to be a test to find out, will America defend the open door policy? You're also going to see Italy invade Ethiopia. You'll see Germany step in and help out with the Spanish Civil War. In 37, Japan is going to go into Manchuria again. And so all of these different incursions are testing to see, with the Americans, they used to have their Great White Fleet that would defend against other countries being aggressive, but now the Americans aren't interested in using that. And so that's essentially an element of appeasement that you see the Americans getting involved in, where they're tolerating the expansion of dictators and doing nothing to stop them because they're unwilling to do so. Next question. What is the Johnson Debt Default Act? Johnson Debt Default Act is from the 1930s, and all it said is that if there's a country that is in economic difficulty and they're struggling to repay our debts, they do not get any further loans from the United States or our bankers. And so this is very much something that will hamstring the English and the French, who will struggle to figure out ways to hold back Adolf Hitler and his aggression because they don't have the money to do so, since they're struggling so heavily with the Great Depression. And they're facing a country in Germany where Germany recognizes that weakness. They stop repaying their debts, their reparations payments, and they're going to rebuild their army, navy, and air force with modern technologies. And by becoming this fascist country where everybody's working for the good of the government, they're going to give everybody jobs either working in the military or in military factories, and their economy is going to recover. That fascist trend is going to essentially be a gigantic New Deal style program where you've got the government spending huge amounts of money to stimulate the economy. But the key thing to recognize with them is they're being militaristic, and so they're arguing that their military is what makes them strong. but then they need to start conquering neighbors to actually justify building more and more weapons. So that's where England and France will get in trouble, was when they stop getting loans from the United States and their economy can't rebuild because of high tariffs and the issues that they're wrestling with. We will be facing a rejuvenated Germany with very much weakened allies economically. Next question, were African Americans in the war? Absolutely. So we had a lot of African Americans who enlisted in the war effort with the idea that they could do in World War II what many people in the previous generation had done during World War I, where they could serve in the military and be able to gain honor and prestige and recognition, and hopefully then demonstrate a desire for equal rights. We have a second great migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And then the big thing to keep in mind is for African Americans, they're desperate for cash because they've been hurt pretty heavily by the Great Depression. They were some of the first to be fired from their jobs, and they've been struggling since that time period. So the idea of a steady paycheck is also something that's very appealing to a lot of people who see the military or military production as a way to be able to get money for their families. Let me see here. Finally, why did Germany invade Poland? Poland had inside of it, it was a country that was created after World War I to protect a group of people from expansion from their neighbors. It's in an area, though, which it could be classified as Prussia. And so this is an area of Germanic-style people who have now found themselves in a different country. And so for Hitler, he saw himself as taking the country back for Germans away from Polish people. And for the Russians, they'd always had their eye on Eastern Poland anyway. So teaming up between Germany and Russia to take out Poland was an obvious choice for them. The thing that's also going to happen is now by taking out Poland, you're going to have Germany that's got a lot of areas along the waterways of Northern Europe. They've also got resources that they've now gained. They've now placated the Russians, so the Russians are now their allies, or at least the Russians think they're allies, so that the Germans can then swing around and go and attack France and England. And then they're planning on double-crossing Russia and driving back through there once they've taken over all of Western Europe. And so it's that victory that the British have with their radar systems in the beginning of World War II that's really crucial, because without England, we really would have had a difficult time trying to find a launching off point to try to figure out ways to get any sort of foothold to fight back against the Germans and the Italians as they were being expansionistic. Checking right now, I do not see any other questions, so I'm hoping that means good news for you guys. So if you are having problems, like I mentioned, I will be checking like I've said in the past, I'll check my emails during the course of the night and also tomorrow during the day during periods 1 and 2. Feel free to stop by also if you have any other questions. So I don't see anything else, so I'm going to take that as a good sign. I wish you the best of luck tonight. Excited to see you guys tomorrow, and good luck.